Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to go over how I approach a session in which I made a lot of blunders and lost a lot of money. Now, typically in poker, when you have a really tough session, the first thing you want to do is hide and not address it at all. But I find that whenever I have a bad session, the most useful thing that I can do is review it extensively, go over all of the different hands that I played, and make sure that it was just bad variance and not my own bad play. So today I'm going to show you guys my process for how I review hands, how I improve my strategy, and how I hold myself responsible when I have bad days. I'm going to jump into GTO Wizard, which is the software that I use to study with and upload all of my hands to, so that you guys can see how I did in the session prior. Let me pull up the session results so you can get an idea of what happened yesterday. So yesterday, I typically play anywhere from 400 NL up to 2K NL, which means I'm buying in for $400 or $2,000, depending on what games are running. So yesterday, I played a lot of hands at 1,000 NL as well as 400 NL, but you can see here we had a pretty tough day. We ended up losing roughly 5,700, and a lot of that came from 510, but almost the same amount of buy-ins came from 400 as well. If you look at it at just buy-ins, we lost 4 buy-ins at 400 NL and 4 buy-ins at 1K NL. So whenever I have a day like this, I typically take a step back and I try and think about whether or not this was just variance or maybe I made a bunch of mistakes. And so I'm going to go over those hands and make sure that I'm discerning between the two. So let me open up Wizard and I will show you guys what the process looks like after I upload a session from yesterday. So here's the session. These are all of the hands that I've marked for review. So you can also go over the review. You can also tag hands through Wizard to review for later, which is what I usually do. But if I take that filter off, you'll see the full session and you'll see how many mistakes that Wizard says we've made. Now, not all of these hands are going to be marked as a mistake that were a mistake, because Wizard doesn't have solutions for every single scenario. But in the scenarios that it does have solutions for, it will review it and it will mark it whether it was a mistake or not. So the first hand that we see here at the top of the list is one of the biggest mistakes of the session. So what I usually typically do is I go through all of my mistakes first and I look through and see what Wizard marked for me to look at. And then I go through all of my biggest pots that I played through the session and kind of see if that was maybe a blunder or if it was just a variance scenario in which I lost a flip or I got coolered in a spot. And that will usually tell me, okay, this was just due to variance or I did actually make a really big mistake. So let's go over the mistakes first. This one is actually a big blunder and a habit that I have that I've seen before. So it is important that I address this. Let's go over this hand history. Under the gun raises, we're in the hijack. We're going to have a 3-bet here with a hand like Jack 10 suited. This is fine. We can also fold. The solver is going to be indifferent between the two options. In this 5-10 game, there is less rake. So in a less raked game, you can usually play these spots more frequently with a raise or a call. You're not going to fold as often. Hijack versus under the gun is a unique scenario in which oftentimes the solver likes just 3-betting or folding. So we see that here. I do 3-bet. Under the gun does something which I wasn't expecting, 4-betting. And at this point, we can choose between call and fold. So far, so good. Nothing too drastic that I wouldn't otherwise play. but I did call this time. Flops king 9-4, 2 diamonds with a heart. Villain goes ahead and c-bets here after a 4-bet pot. Typically, I think a king high board is going to be a range bet, meaning they're going to bet 100% of the time. So in that case, we're never folding for obvious reasons. We have a monster draw. But I don't think we're raising either, because this is a hand that just has a lot of equity that wants to realize that equity. And I think that calling in position is the best way to do that. If we do put a raise in here, we're subjected to potentially under the gun shoving, and then we're going to have to go all in. Yes, we do technically realize our equity, but that equity might not be so good against the in the gun jam range. So I decide to call. Turns a 3 of hearts. Villain goes ahead and bets again. Very standard spot for villain to bet twice. I, unfortunately, jam all in here. Now, you might think this is not a terrible bluff because we have a lot of equity when called most of the time. However, in a 4-bet pot, a lot of under the gun's weak hands are going to be ace high flushes, flush draws. So if we do jam a hand like Jack 10 of diamonds, it's very unlikely that villain is going to fold an ace high flush draw on the turn here if I do jam. So we don't really get those hands to fold. And a lot of the time they're just going to call with their king X, with their, dominating flush draws. Maybe queens can even hero call here. I'm not sure what the equilibrium might look like, but I do know that this hand is always going to be a better call, and you can see that reflected in the EV here. The EV difference is massive between call and all in. That's because, again, when we do shove, we're not getting that many hands to fold here outside of maybe something like ace queen offsuit, maybe like ace 5 with no diamonds or hearts. But the problem, again, is when we do shove, we're going to still get called by a lot of his weaker flush draws that have us dominated. So if we look at the solution here and we see what hands are going to bet on the turn for bet 50, you can see, again, a lot of his weak and trash hands are going to be these ace high combos, ace 5 diamonds, ace 5 spades, ace queen of hearts, ace queen offsuit, jacks and tens. So the interesting thing about this hand is that under the gun can actually turn their tens into a bluff, because if they bet their tens for a medium sizing on the turn, we're forced to fold some of our jacks or queens potentially. You can see here that our jacks are going to fold at a high frequency, as well as some of our queens, which means under the gun is incentivized to bluff something like pocket tens. There aren't that many hands that under the gun can choose from for bluffs, since the king high board pairs a lot of the weak hand 4-bets from pre-flop. So all of their king, queen, king, jack, king 10, that is going to make top pair now. And a lot of their ace X combos are going to have strong flush draws or even a combo draw in the case of ace 5. So when you're dealing with such a narrow range, sometimes the solver is going to pick the weakest part of that range, even if it does seem like a counterintuitive combination to use, something like a pair, but it does have a good effect in folding out better hands when you do use that. So that being said, another reason why shoving Jack 10 of diamonds is bad is because we have blockers to those bluffs. We have blockers to their jacks and their tens that might be turning their hand into a bluff at a frequency. So whenever you're bluffing, you don't want to be blocking their weak hands. You want to be blocking strong hands, or you want to be unblocking the weak part of their range that's folding. And in this case, we're blocking that weak part of their range that is bluffing, and we're not really blocking that much value with our Jack 10 2 diamonds. Maybe we're blocking some hands like King 10 and Jack 10 or sorry, king 10 and king jack of diamonds, but that's about it. And I'm not sure if, yeah, they might be checking that hand at a high frequency on the turn. If they have king jack, if they have king 10 of diamonds, they might be betting a different size as well. So we're not really blocking those hands either when villain bets half pot. So this was a big mistake for those reasons. I should have, if I was going to find a bluff here on the turn, picked something that was a bit better with blocking strong hands, something like ace 10 of diamonds, which blocks pocket aces and also blocks ace king. And we're never really dominated when we jam from another draw. We can also still get better hands to fold, like ace queen. So if villain was bluffing on the turn here as under the gun, you'll see that a lot of their bluffs are also going to be ace queen offsuit. So we want something a little weaker than ace queen offsuit that we can jam, that blocks the value, has equity when called and not dominated. And ace 10 suited is kind of the perfect hand to jam turn here. So we had that blunder in game, and it's tempting sometimes for myself to just think, screw it, I'm just going to jam here. I have a combo draw, it's fine. But for all of those reasons I just mentioned, we're going to run into a stronger part of their range more often because we're blocking those weak hand bluffs. So this was a big blunder. So I would count this obviously as a big mistake for myself. And in order to fix this in the future, I would want to focus more on making sure that in position, I am blocking some strong hands. I'm not blocking their weak hand bluffs when I turn my hand into a bluff. And I focus on those types of characteristics or heuristics, if you will, when raising in position. So next hand, go here. And ace king suited. We are in the big blind. So this is a spot where I think GTO Wizard sometimes has an issue where it doesn't account for some strategies that are extreme. What I mean by that is outside of what the solution has for the equilibrium. So if we 3-bet here to a 12 big blind sizing, which is exactly what GTO Wizard would do, then villain here at 135 big blinds is more likely to go something like 24 to 30 big blinds. That's within the range of some of the solutions that GTO Wizard has. However, villain goes for a 40 big blind 4-bet in position, which is a monster 4-bet. This is a really big sizing for the 135 stack depth, and I'm pretty sure that this is a blunder for villain. So whenever villain makes a blunder and uses a size that's not within the solution is going to make it that it's going to make it that they chose the sizing that wizard would. So in this case, you can see under the gun has raise 30. So this is not really a raise 30. This is a raise 39. So in this case, I decided to jam because I don't think 5-betting makes a lot of sense. If villain went 30, then we could go 55 and potentially have that 5-bet, which is what the solver wants me to do here, or we could have called. But because it's a really bad sizing for me to be calling out of position, I decided to just jam this hand, and I would also probably jam some aces. I would probably jam some pocket kings to balance the ace king suited, and also maybe some frequency of ace king offsuit. I don't know, but it's a pretty tight range for jamming here. So I ended up jamming. I think this is fine given villain's sizing. There isn't a way for me to solve this unless I pre-flop solved the exact sizing that villain used. I could potentially look for a custom sizing in the research section which has a lot of different sizings for the game that I'm playing. So if I look at under the gun, you can see it lists a lot of different sizings for 3-betting. And then under the gun has all of these different sizings for 4-betting. And you can see that when you give the solver a bunch of different sizings here, it's not going to choose anything other than 24. This is at 100 big blinds deep. Now, if we up the size to 150, you can start to see the solver wants to use a 30 big blind sizing or even a 33 big blind sizing. However, it's never going to use bigger than a 36 big blind sizing. So we can assume that, again, that was probably a mistake. Also, they had a stack depth of under 150. So yeah, I'm trying to break down how I can discern whether or not someone's making a mistake with using the solver and the available sizes that are that GTO Wizard has, so that we can compare them to the other person. So let's say that they did just use the 36 sizing. Let's see what the solver wants to do in my shoes. And it looks like it doesn't really want to have a 5-bet anymore, perhaps because GTO Wizard didn't put a 5-bet in here. But I have a feeling that even if you did put something like a 60 big blind 5-bet, it would still choose 150 jam over the 5-bet at this stack depth. And you can see the solution is pretty similar to what I was mentioning. We're pretty much jamming aces, kings, and ace king with a little smattering of queens and jacks and tens and nines at a very low frequency. But most of the time, I think we're going to have this upper left-hand box here of combos, which is aces, kings, ace, king for jamming. So I don't think that this necessarily was a mistake for me, even though Wizard had marked it as a mistake. If you look at another example of 125 big blinds, which is maybe a little closer to the 136, it's 11 big blinds difference instead of 14. So also looking at this possible scenario, we'll look at under the gun, doesn't really want to be raising much bigger than 30. 27 is the most common sizing here. So again, at 125 big blinds, if villain does use this smaller 4-bet, we can use a 5-bet. However, again, when they use this really big sizing in position, we're just going to be jamming or calling most of the time. So that's what happened here. Villain had ace king offsuit and unfortunately ran it once and ran off a flush against me. So that was a big part of my loss yesterday, was running bad. This is clearly variance. We saw that it's very unlikely that this was a mistake by me for jamming. We just happened to run bad in that scenario. So the next hand, ace-8 offsuit on the button. I open small blind calls, ace-9-2 flop. This is a texture which I'm usually going to bet small or check. Now, note that the small blind only has 22 big blinds. This was a recreational player, and I typically treat recreational players a bit different than the pros when it comes to my strategy. I lean a little more into thin value. I lean a little more into exploitative play. If I think that they check back the turn too often, then maybe I just stab turn with some weaker hands, for example, stuff like that. So ace high board, I do defend by, or sorry, not defend. I do check here by balancing my range a little bit. I'm not just always going to bet an ace, because I do think that recreational players do play poorly when I check back in position as well. So I don't typically exploit the flop very often, but if I were to, it would depend on what I think the population is doing. So if I think they're betting when I check too much, then checking back some strong ace X makes a lot of sense. Or if I think they're overfolding on the flop, then maybe I check back when I have it. Or if I don't have it, then I'll bet more often, etc. So I check back. Villain goes for a large bet. I call. We get to the river. 2 of spades, and you can see here villain just shoves 16 big blinds into 14. So they're overbet shoving. We're sitting here with a bluff catcher without a spade. they're basically repping, I want to say, as strong as ace 10 maybe. I don't know. But this is a scenario again where I don't think this player is going to be playing like the equilibrium. I think that if we took a look at the range for them defending the small blind at 20 big blinds, you might see, you might not really see very many calls, especially if I'm raising to 2.5x. At this stage, I don't think there's going to be a solution for 2.5x and 20 bigs. Just a guess here. But this is, again, a spot I might just pass by and chalk it up to variance if I had lost, because I don't think this is a terrible call given this is a recreational player. Maybe they're getting out of line because I checked back the flop. And I did call. They did show up with pocket fours, which I thought was kind of an interesting bluff, because I don't necessarily think it's bad to bluff fours here, because I am going to have to fold some like pocket jacks or pocket tens if I get to the river and they jam. So not a terrible bluff by Villain here, but I do think that the overall equilibrium is going to look a bit different given they have a flatting range versus 2.5x at 22 bigs. So I think actually fours might jam pre-flop, given I open 2.5x when they have 22. So yeah, I do think that that's not going to be another hand of note. Here's a hand that I do think is really interesting that could potentially be another blunder for myself. Hijack opens, again, a recreational player. You can tell by the broken stack, meaning they have under 100 big blinds, so 85 big blinds here. They open, I defend, 6-4-4 board. I decide to lead this flop. This is a very typical strategy out of position on board textures in which the big blind is going to interact well with. So because there's two low cards as the board pair, we have a lot of trips in our range. So I decide to lead. A mixed strategy here with different combos. This one I think is fine to mix between check and small bet. I go ahead and small bet. Villain snap raises to a pot size bet. Now this is, again, not typical. You're not going to see this in a solution. I don't think pot raise is an option if I do lead. We can confirm this by checking the solution, but if I had to guess, you're not going to want to raise pots on a board pair. Maybe that's incorrect. Maybe they were right here. Let's take a look. Yeah, not a very common occurrence here. 0.3% I'm going to chalk up to solver noise, meaning the solver didn't finish running the solution to a high degree of accuracy, in which case sometimes the solver is prone to, including some combos that if you kept running the solver or you solved down to a better accuracy, you would see this be removed completely. So raise 50 is more likely the strategy here. So again, this is kind of, we're in a uncharted territory against a recreational player. I do defend versus this raise though, because I think that if you lead into a player and they have something like a big flush draw, if they have something like ace king, perhaps they can find some weak bluffs here. It is probably more likely a value raise with like an overpair, aces, kings, jacks, queens. So yeah, it's not a great bet call here. I think if I were to do this spot again, I would fold to the raise, especially the pot sized raise. Maybe if they use the half pot sizing like we saw in the solution, this would be a much easier call because it's more likely they can have some weaker type of hands. But when he snap raises pot, I think I should just be done with this hand out of position. I ended up calling and making a full house on the turn, which at this point we're in no man's land. This isn't really part of a solution. So I don't think that Wizard is going to be accurate at this stage. I do think it's important to keep looking through the hand just to make sure, in theory, maybe I'm not making a mistake. But if I did lead and I get raised pot and I call, I should have some quads in my range, right? I should have some slow played 6-6. I should have some 4x that I lead and call. So I think the reason GTO Wizard wants me to lead here is because it's possible I have a range advantage after calling a really, really big bet, because I'm not going to be doing that very light. And in theory, Wizard probably thinks that hijack is going to be balanced with this raise with a bunch of weak hands. So Wizard wants me to lead here and attack the board, but again, probably not accurate and a little misleading, because I don't think the hijack's playing an equilibrium strategy here. They bet large and I call again. So at this point, I'm kind of just hoping that they have some kind of bluff, because that's the only thing we really beat. We don't really block value either. We don't block any of the 5-4 suited. So it's not the best hand to be bluff catching with out of position versus what looks like a very strong range. So again, I think I probably could find a fold on the turn. And then the queen of clubs comes in and they jam and I finally fold the river, which, yeah, I think I should have probably folded the flop versus the pot size bet. If we take a look at this, I do think it is an interesting spot, because if I was against a reg and we were at our normal stack depth, we could take something away from this hand, even though it looks like a chalked hand and there's a lot of things that are happening, not in equilibrium. The strategy is still there, right? So I can still have a lead on this 6-4-4 board. Maybe I do this against a regular in the hijack, and the regular has to respond by raising this half pot sizing with a bunch of different combos that are behind pocket fives. So they have to raise the flop with a lot of Broadway combos. They have to raise the flop with some ace high stuff. And so when they do that, then I respond by, I imagine, calling most of the time with fives with a heart. I don't think I'm ever going to fold. And then on the turn, a 4 of diamonds. Let's see if in theory there is some leads on this turn. The answer is no. That makes more sense to me. So I check, and let's say villain does go ahead and continue betting here. It looks like they really want to use that overpair advantage against us and start overbetting. Or large betting at the smallest size. So let's say they do just use a large bet. Pocket fives at this point is going to be indifferent, and we can in fact just fold. If I do call and the river's a queen of clubs, just like in the example, I check. Hijack is now going to likely jam a lot of the time or overbet. Let's say they overbet. And pocket fives is going to fold at 100% frequency. So if we had actually played this hand in an equilibrium strategy, it wouldn't have been that bad to play it exactly how I played it, right? The only problem was hijack raised a bigger sizing than normal, and they also were a little shorter in stack depth. Other than that, I think this hand wasn't necessarily a big mistake, other than if I wanted to exploit the villain, I could fold on an earlier street if I thought they were too value heavy. But in theory, given the strategy we just looked at, if they're balanced, it's maybe not the worst way to play my combo there. And it is really important. It's important that you understand what the equilibrium strategy looks like, so that when someone does something out of the ordinary, like villain in that hand where they raise pot, you can find those exploits and understand, okay, he's never supposed to raise pot here. I should have just folded to the pot size bet, because that looks more like aces, kings, queens. He should have had a half pot sizing. So maybe in the future, if he does have a half pot sizing, now we know when he does go the big sizing, that's probably more likely a value hand, and the half pot's more likely a bluff or something like that. So it does pay off to understand what the equilibrium strategy looks like, even though this is not really a common scenario to see. Next hand, ace 8 in the cutoff. So we raise, get 3-bet by the button. I always have a hard time remembering exactly what the equilibrium looks like pre-flop here, cutoff versus button. I know that suited aces can be mixed at a frequency between 4-betting and calling. This case, it looks like this one can 4-bet or call. There isn't much folding because this is the widest scenario you're going to play out of position in a 3-bet pot. So other than I guess technically small blind versus big blind, but cutoff versus button is wide versus wide. Ace 8 suited is a strong hand because of how wide button can 3-bet here. So we defend king 10-10 board. So this is actually an interesting spot because the button is going to flop bet here 100% of the time. This is a very good board for the 3-better. So out of position, I'm always going to check. They're always going to bet. And I was trying to think of different hands I could check raise bluff here. The first hand that obviously comes to mind is something like Queen Jack, something with a straight draw, maybe Ace Queen, maybe a low pocket pair like pocket threes or deuces or fours. It's possible. Or something like a suited ace. A suited ace does a good job of blocking top pair, blocking aces, blocking trips. And I figured in the moment this wouldn't be a terrible one to raise the flop with. So I went for it because it has good blocker effects. It has some backdoor equity. We get better hands to fold the flop. If he has something like pocket sevens, I think at a frequency they might have to fold those types of hands. Some better ace high hands might have to fold versus a check raise. So I went for it, but that was a mistake. It wasn't a good enough hand for a couple of reasons. One, we have better hands to do it with. So you can see here that the cutoff wants to be raising a bigger sizing than I chose. I chose a 35% sizing, so I should have gone for a bigger sizing, which makes sense because if we're raising a king 10-10 board, we're essentially repping a 10 or a strong king. So anytime you're repping a very polarized range, you typically want to size up with your value, and you're also sizing up with some of your bluffs. So on a king 10-10 board out of position, let's take a look at what the weak hands are for bluffing. If I highlight the weak hands and trash hands down here, you'll see that pocket deuces does pop up here. So we're using a low pair as a semi bluff to get something like fives or sixes or sevens or eights to fold. And then we have something like jack 9 suited, which makes a lot of sense because we have a gut shot. We're blocking all of the 10x and the king x at a frequency. And then we're also getting ace high to fold. So if villain bets the flop with ace 8 of spades, that hand has to just fold versus a check raise. So jack high is a really good combo to check raise bluff. Same thing with queen jack. Same thing with ace jack, although this one is not blocking the, or not getting a lot of ace highs that are better to fold anymore, but it does still have that property of gut shot, straight draw, backdoor flush draw, really good blockers, could get some lower pairs to fold either by the flop or the turn. And then you have ace queen. So this is actually a much more straightforward range than I would have guessed for semi-bluffing the flop here. You can see it's all intuitive in terms of either we're doing it with a gut shot, an open-ended straight draw, or a low pocket pair. Maybe it's a little hard for some of you guys to find these low pairs to bluff with, but the way you have to think about it is when villain has medium pairs that they can bet fold on the flop, sometimes it's good for us to use weaker pairs that can get those hands to fold. And if we hit a 2, then we end up winning a big pot against his 10x or whatever. So there's a lot of good things that can happen when you raise the flop with weak pairs on a paired board like this out of position. So I ended up using the wrong size and the wrong combo. There is a little bit, just to kind of, defend myself slightly here. There is some ace 9 of hearts check raising that happens, which isn't really ace 8 of hearts, but the EV difference between the two, we can see for raising ace 8 of hearts, isn't that bad. If you look at raise 83, which is the sizing that the solver prefers, you can see it's 0.18 EV loss. Whereas if I use something like raise 55, it's a bigger EV loss. So if we're going to raise this hand, the solver wants to raise a bigger sizing, or use something like ace 9 of hearts. Ace 9 of hearts does a better job of blocking the strong hands with the 9 of hearts. So 9-10 of hearts is going to be a common combo here. And so, yeah, it is a good spot to find a very small frequency of bluffing with ace 9 of hearts. But for the most part, you should probably just stick to what is more, prevalent and obvious, which is going to be those straight draws and pairs. So this was another mistake by me. These are all pretty small mistakes so far, and this one actually worked out for me, so didn't really lose money there. We haven't really figured out where much of my losses have come from so far. Doesn't seem like it's going to be a lot from the mistakes, but maybe more so from the variance. So far, we've seen the ace king of clubs lose to ace king offsuit pre-flop. So let's take a look at some more hands. Maybe we'll keep unlocking some variance or blunders. I open cutoff, button 3 bets to 10. So this is another example of deviating from the equilibrium. You're not really 3 betting to 10 big blinds very often. This was also a recreational player, and I wasn't really sure what to do against this really big sizing out of position. I do know that you can jam ace king offsuit in a scenario like this. So ace king suited is usually just going to be a 4-bet if you're going to play it, because it's such a strong hand and doesn't mind calling an all in. But ace king offsuit isn't really that excited about calling an all in versus a 4-bet. When we 4-bet and we get jammed on, not very excited for calling an all in. But ace king of clubs has more equity, going to perform better versus a jam. And yeah, you see the solver likes to 4-bet this one instead of jam all in. But I decided, because button is using this really big sizing, that I was just going to jam all in. So you can see the discrepancy here. Maybe I could have just clicked it back. Maybe I could have made it something like 22 bigs, 24 bigs, instead of just ripping it in here. But I did jam all in, and we got called by essentially a flip. They ran it once again, and we lost. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't think this is a big mistake. If it is a mistake, we could look at the theory behind, let's see if we can find research NL 500, 100 bigs. Maybe we can see, what was the scenario? Cutoff button. Yeah, there's no raise 10 to even use here. We have raise 9. And raise 9 is used, so maybe raise 10 isn't that bad of a strategy. And then on the cutoff, you can see against raise 9, we're going to use 22 or 27. So if I were to play this again, I probably would have just made it something like 22, 23 instead of jam. Seems like jam is not too favorable. If I am going to jam, like I mentioned, ace king offsuit is good for that, or pocket jacks. But we don't want to be jamming ace king suited. We're just going to completely 4-bet this combo. And then, of course, if they jam, I just snap call, or never folding ace king suited. So this one might have been a little bit of a misstep pre-flop by me. The playability of 4-betting this hand is also nice. Typically, you're 4-betting a lot of suited combos because they... Sorry about that. Mic went out. Typically, you're 4-betting the suited combos because they play better post-flop in a low SPR. You're going to have more equity when you flop a backdoor draw. So yeah, could have put a 4-bet in there instead of a jam. Yeah, let's take a look at another one. This one's actually interesting because it's hard to find this, but it's good in theory. Small blind opens, big blind defends, 7-5-2. So obviously we flop a gutter and a backdoor flush draw, small blind checks. Now we can have a few different strategies here. We can medium bet 50%, we can small bet, we can check. I go for the small bet. Small blind check raises. So first off, they check raise to 64% pot, which I'm not going to look too much into that. in terms of sizing, because I don't think it really tells us much of anything yet. I will say that 64% is a little bigger than other players probably use. I think most players use 50 on a 7 high board, but maybe there's some like difference between, you know, strategy, and 64 is absolutely fine. I'm not going to look into that. So I defend here just knowing that I have a gutter and a backdoor flush draw with a 9. I could also hit a 9 and make the best hand. Turn is unique. It's a unique card because anytime you take aggression on a flop and then the turn changes the structure of the board, where top pair is now a different combo and that top pair is within someone's range more often than the other person's, it does change the strategy a bit. So once the small blind check raises flop, I think the king is going to be in their favor, but they're also going to need to split their range, which means they're going to have a small bet for some of the hands that they check raise the flop with, like pocket queens and jacks and tens that now don't necessarily have top pair and can get beat by my king X that maybe floated the flop with spades or backdoor clubs or whatever. So there's going to be a small bet. There's going to be a medium bet for maybe a king. So maybe they check raise something like king X of spades. That one might want a medium bet. And then there might even be an overbet still, which is going to be a more polar range that's unaffected by the king, which might be something like pocket aces, pocket fives, pocket sevens, 7-5 suited, pocket deuces. Maybe they check raised ace king and hit a king, or a king queen suited and hit a king, and that one wants to go really big. So there's a couple of strategies you can have on the turn. Villain chose the small sizing, which I think is great for the reasons I mentioned. Apparently the solver wants me to float here, even with just a bare gut shot in position versus the small bet. Now, this is very uncomfortable for a lot of players to float a bare 9 high gut shot in position, but a lot of good things can happen in position. One, the board can develop where the small blind wants to check the river and we can turn our hand into a bluff. Two, we can obviously hit the nuts where we just win a stack. Three, we could hit a 9 or a 6 and that still could be the potential best hand, right? So if they're check raising something like ace 7 and we hit a 9, that could still be good. So even though it looks like we have just a gut shot here, there's a lot of different things that can happen on the river when you're in position and you're floating versus a small sizing. So the solver wants me to float twice here. I missed the float. I ended up folding. I ran this out in several different ways so that I can learn from that mistake and understand why the solver wants to float that hand in position, because I don't think it's too intuitive here. So if you look at the small bet, you can see that is part of a strategy. And if you look at the overbet, that's also a part of the strategy. So we were right in assuming that there's a multiple sizing strategy going on here. I don't know what the solver would pick if there was one sizing, but it would probably be somewhere between 50 and 33 if I had to guess. So they ended up using the small one. And you can see here, we're not folding that often. We're only folding like 20% of the time here. We're continuing with almost any combo that has some kind of draw. So if you look at the different draws here on the right, you can see we're not folding any draw other than 8-4 with no flush draw. That's like the one draw that we're actually folding. But we're floating all of the spade draws. We're floating all of the open-ended straight draws. We're floating some of the gut shots, right? So why are we floating these hands, right? I guess because small blind is going to bet a very high frequency on the turn because, like we said, the king was probably favorable to them. So they want to continue betting here. So they're betting at a 80-ish% frequency, and they're going to have a lot of trash. So let's say they check raise something like 10-8 of clubs. that had really good backdoors on the flop, had some good removal effects to my stronger hands, and now they're on the turn. Well, sometimes they're going to bet this turn because it's favorable to them. So because the small blind has such a wide range, including a bunch of trash hands, also going to have something like Queen 9, and we float, they have to give up a lot of those trash hands. So let's say the river is something like, let's try a random card, four of hearts. Now on the river, the small blind's still going to check 24% of the time with a lot of these like queen high hands, with spades that might miss, jack high hands with spades, ace high hands with a 5, spades. A lot of hands are just going to give up on the river. And when they do check that river, 9-6 is going to be there to bluff, right? So now we have these weaker hands that are very relevant for getting better hands to fold and potentially blocking some value. I think it's possible that 9-6 blocks something like pocket nines that might take this line. So if I go ahead and bet the river here, looks like 9-6 of clubs wants to mainly bet 87 or 62. So a larger medium sizing. Maybe there's some kind of removal effect with a 9. I'm not sure. Or a 6. So 9-6 blocks a hand like 7-6 suited in this case. So having the 6 of clubs is relevant for blocking the value. And obviously we're unblocking a lot of these queen high, jack high, 10 high folds. So it's a really good hand to float in position because A, we have the equity with, hitting a gutter, but B, we can also turn our hand into a bluff on rivers and potentially hit something like a 9 and just check back and win the pot. But it is tough. It is tough to find those spots. All right, next hand. Pocket twos, we are in the button and the hijack opens 2.5x. So this is where I go back and forth between finding these 3 bets. It's a very delicate equilibrium when you look at a solution pre-flop. If villain opens the hijack at 2.5x, we don't really want to be 3-betting these weaker pairs. If the hijack opens a min raise, then twos becomes a mix 3-bet and we're calling more often. So I must have been on autopilot or not recognized that the hijack used the 2.5x open. Most players use a min raise from the hijack or under the gun. So I ended up 3-betting this hand, which was a mistake. But assuming that they open 2x and we 3-bet, let's play this out. Flops king, queen, 5. This is going to be a really good board for me to c-bet 100% of my range because of our advantage on a board texture like this. So I go ahead and bet small, villain calls. Turn is a 9 of diamonds, which brings in a straight. However, hijack shouldn't have that much jack 10 suited in an equilibrium. I think there's going to be some mixed folding with that hand, or maybe even 4-betting. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but let's actually just take a quick look so I don't say something incorrect. But I do think first we have to change this back to the raise 2 so we can see that pocket twos is now mixing a 3-bet pre-flop. You can see here. And then the calling range for the hijack. Yeah, jack 10 suited is in fact mixing between fold, 4-bet, and call, but it's not going to be in villain's range a high frequency. So the 9 isn't that scary because it's not going to change too much after I c-bet the flop. I think that they're going to have to fold pocket 9s, so they're not going to make any sets. So the 9's not going to change that much, but I'm going to have more jack 10 suited because I have that hand for 3-betting. I also still have all of my strong hands, so I need to find some bluffs. And because this was a low frequency 3-bet pre-flop, we can still use this as a bluff post-flop. We can get some stronger hands if they have something like queen 10 of hearts. Maybe that is in an awkward spot if I bet the turn. Maybe they have something like 5-6 suited that decided to call the flop, right? We don't even have to fold out really strong hands at this point. We can just be folding out a 5. Maybe they called pocket 6s with a club and decided to call once, right? So 2s, going back to the paired board example, is a good hand to turn into a bluff on the turn. So I go for the half pot, they check raise, and I folded. So this is a fine played hand. The reason Wizard picked this up as a mistake is because they opened 2.5x versus my 3-bet, or I 3-bet versus their 2.5x. So going down the line here, I'm not seeing too many really big mistakes left. So this is where I would want to filter for the biggest pots played. We've already identified a couple of all-in spots that we lost for 135 bigs and 100 bigs that weren't necessarily mistakes. I mean, if we're nitpicking, this could have been a 4-bet with the ace-king suited. But let's look at some of the big coolers, right? Because this might determine our big loss from yesterday. So we take a look here. King-queen offsuit. Let's take a look at this hand. Button versus cutoff. I decide to flat versus a cutoff raise. Big blind calls. So this is 3-handed. This is why we didn't see this pop up in Wizard. Naturally, Wizard doesn't have the 3-handed solutions available to compare to my hand history, so it will mark it as a no solution, and I can't review it. However, recently, Wizard has added multi-way solving, so now I can take a look at how I played this. So let's run this hand history, and then we'll see in the new solver whether or not this was well played or not. So I go ahead and small bet the button. Big blind 3-bets here. Immediately alarm bells go off because anything that the big blind defends and check raises is going to be really, really strong. And I recently learned a heuristic in which the big blind shouldn't really be raising in this scenario. So this is the first indication that I should have known villain has a very strong hand. There are going to be some combo draws in his range, so I can't fold the flop necessarily, but we are alerted that villain is repping a very polar range. I don't know if they should be raising or not. We'll take a look at that in a minute, but I do have a fairly strong hand here. So I do go ahead and defend the flop. Turn comes and villain goes for a large bet out of position. So it's pretty standard so far in terms of sizing theory. The jack could have brought some combo draws. So if they did find a check raise on the flop with something like 10-9 of clubs or 6-7 of clubs, they already had a combo draw, or something like queen. They can't have queen 10 of clubs because we have the queen of clubs. 10-7 of clubs would likely be in their range at a frequency. So it's possible that they still have some draws. I decided to call. River's a complete brick and they shove. Okay. So let's look at the multi-way scenario. And then we can kind of determine whether or not I made a mistake in this line. So here's the 150 big blinds. How deep was everybody? I can change this to make it more accurate when I solve. So 100 big blinds. Yeah. So what we can do is we're going to solve here with the post-flop AI. And we're going to change everyone's stack depth. So the big blind was 126. The cutoff was 101. And we were 127. So 126... cutoff is 101. I was 127. So this is the right stack depth. The pot size was 7.1. So we can change the pot size here. I'll just make it 7 for simplicity's sake. And that looks good. So now we have to create a strategy here. So in order to solve multi-way, you have to input the strategy that you want the solver to solve. And I'm going to have 2 sizings for our strategy and then a overbets. And then the raise size, I'm going to make it 50 and 100. And the re-raise is going to be 50. So pretty standard looking solver, strategy. This is what we had to do before library solutions back in the PioSolver days. So we create the solution, and this is where I think we're going to find out if the big blind is ever supposed to have a check raise on this board versus me, because the button is going, the big blind is going to have the weakest range on this flop, which means it's not going to want to check raise very often. This is something I think that players are going to they're going to start learning and applying to their game, since this just came out recently. Well, let's see before I talk too much about them making a mistake. But big blind checks, cutoff checks. I go for a small bet. Another heuristic I've learned from multi-way solving is that we're typically going to choose a small bet if we have the option. There aren't too many scenarios I've seen where we're going to have a large bet or overbet. So here's where I think, okay, I am wrong. The big blind does have a check raise. So I thought that there wasn't going to be a check raise from the big blind in this scenario, but turns out that is incorrect. So learned something. And it is fine for them to have a mix of combos here between, I imagine, draws, second pair. Let's see. I have to make sure that I'm not including value. So ace high flush draws. There aren't that many club draws, are there? Yeah, there are. There's some. 6-5, 7-5, 7-6. So the combo draws, the 4x of clubs. There aren't any trash hands, interestingly. It's all weak hands that are clubs, which I guess is because they have a lot of equity. The trash hands are going to be the pairs. So there's a category of hand in multi-way where the solver likes to turn bottom pair or second pair into a bluff. This is uncommon in a lot of lower games. You don't see a lot of players playing this strategy, but it's a really good strategy because if you're raising in a spot like this, you're basically repping two pair or full house or a set. So when you do raise flop and bet three streets, if the villain has two pair or a set, they're obviously never folding. So the best way to block the top part of villain's range when you're bluffing is to block second pair. These are the auto calls for the in position player. So it's really good to turn your pairs into a bluff out of position, in multi-way out of frequency. Or you can have your traditional like flush draw, straight draw type of hand, combo draw, whatever. You can see that in the weak hands. You're going to have some backdoor draws with second pairs, so like 10-8 of hearts. So if villain is aware of this strategy, and it looks like they did choose to check raise, so they should have something weak in their range, right? Although their raise sizing was a little bigger than what the solver wants to do. 100% is fine as well, just not really common. I would probably just elect to choose the 50, given the frequency is so low here for 100. But let's say they do raise. I'm now on the button with king queen offsuit, and we can see that I am never folding king queen offsuit. In fact, sometimes I'm even 3-betting it. I am going to call when I have a club in my hand more often than not. So I go ahead and call. I could change the sizing a little bit, but that's just being a little nitpicky. So jack of spades on the turn. I think we're going to see some overbets from the big blind or large bets. You can see there's a large bet. So far, pretty typical. Then king queen offsuit is going to start to mix folds. However, again, when we have the queen of clubs, it looks like we're calling at a higher frequency. So I did defend the turn here. And then the river is a 3 of diamonds. So this is where practice doesn't always line up with theory. So when villain goes for the river bet here, first of all, it's going to be a bit of a different sizing because I think he jammed, what was it, 129% instead of 173%. But the ranges are going to be very similar, right? The theory is going to be very similar. Again, I could nitpick the turn here and make them raise a bigger, or the flop here and make them raise a bigger sizing to match up to what we're looking at. Why don't I just do that? So what did they raise the flop? 75%. Yeah. So if I do this, you can change the raise size on one part of the game tree, which is pretty cool. So instead of having, two sizings, I'm just going to make him raise 75 now, right? So that's going to change a little bit of his strategy in terms of frequency. Probably going to check raise less when you make it a bigger sizing. This is going to be a little wonky, but we'll see if this works. You also made the pot smaller? No, the pot was what it was in the example. So I go for the raise. Now, fold king, queen offsuit. You can actually see some king, queen offsuit is actually folding to the larger sizing without a club. But we did have a club. Turn was the jack of diamonds. No, spades, sorry. Not going to make that big of a difference, but we'll change it to spades. And now I think the big blind's going to use the large size more often because of the SPR. And then king, queen with a club is still going to be a fairly high frequency call. And then the river was a 3 of diamonds. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit more comparable to the exact scenario. And you can see the shoves, okay? So villain is supposed to shove here. First, let's look at the obvious hands, the value. The value hands, I think, are just going to be intuitive for anyone to figure out. It's going to be sets. Pocket 8s and pocket 4s for shoving here. There are going to be some combos of like jack 8 of hearts that turn to pair. That is going to be dependent on villain finding those flop check raise bluffs. So that's important to note. And then also same thing with the 4-3 of spades. We're going to make 2 pair with that combo as well. So those 2 hands are going to go for value. Those might not be shoving. They might be using a different sizing. But the ones that are shoving basically are going to be sets, 8s and 4s. Now, what are the bluffs? If we highlight the bluffs here under the trash hands and the weak hands, you can see that villain needs to turn second pair into a bluff. Second pair or third pair. 5-4 suited is a very good example of this. That might be more intuitive because you have a combo draw on the flop. You think, oh, I have a lot of equity here. I'm just going to check raise. And then on the turn, you turn your hand into a bluff and you get to the river. And yeah, sure. We're blocking sets. We're unblocking some better folds. And this makes a lot of sense to bluff with. So I think villain can find some of these combo draws to bluff the river with. Maybe something like 4 deuce is a little more unintuitive, where you need to set that up on the flop by the river to bluff it, which I think is lacking a little bit in practice for some of these guys. But same thing with ace 8 suited. You kind of have to set this up. So let's make a couple of assumptions. A, players aren't necessarily finding these check raise bluffs with second or third pair. And B, they're always going to raise those stronger hands on this kind of texture. So it's possible that they're under bluffing in this spot, but let's take a look at what theory wants to do. So if big blind jams, what is king queen going to do? It's going to be indifferent on the river. And you're going to see my combo mix a call about a third of the time. So spade club. Where's the spade club? There it is, top. Spade club is going to call a third of the time. So I don't think this is necessarily going to be a mistake or a blunder. This was a big pot in which I called. And of course, we ran into pocket 4s. So villain actually had pocket 4s in this hand as the big blind, and we lost. But making sure that I'm making good decisions in these spots with my hand is going to determine whether or not I feel like this was avoidable, or maybe I could have found some, call that is good and they found a bluff and it turned out good, right? So yeah, when it comes to like picking the hands to call with, the obvious ones are going to be the 2 pair plus, right? Sets. And then you have some top pair hands, king, queen, king, jack. We're not going to have too many stronger top pairs than king, queen, and king, jack because we called the button. So remember, we don't have ace, king. We don't really have those really strong combos, pocket kings. So yeah, not a bad spot to bluff catch. Hopefully villain has some kind of bluff here that they can find. And yeah, not bad. So let's look at another big pot that we played. This one was actually really interesting as well. So big blind versus under the gun. I defend ace 8-6 board. This is going to be a good one to check raise. I go for the check raise. We could have used the pot size raise as well. Again, ace high boards are polarizing boards in which we want to go for a bigger sizing out of position. We're representing something like ace king and better. So raising big makes sense. I go for the medium size, which isn't a mistake. And then I go for an overbet on the turn. So this is a good play. Sometimes we're going to have pocket eights, ace 6, 8-6, ace king, 6-4 or 6-5 suited that was semi-bluffing on the flop and turn trips. That's something that I think a lot of players might not expect, but I do have a lot of trips here on this 3rd pair board. Yeah, on the 3rd pair board pair. That's when we have trips the most. So I go for the overbet with my straight draw. So it's also hard to find too many bluffs on this texture, right? We don't have that much equity with our weak hands other than an open-ended straight draw. So I go for that. Then on the river, I really wasn't sure what to do on this 7 of diamonds because I felt like my hand was not the best hand. At this point, I think he's going to have a lot of ace X. I think he's going to have some 8X. If he has something like 7-8 himself, if he has something like 8-9, maybe he finds a call. Pocket kings is possible to float the turn here. So let's take a look at what I should have done on the river because it didn't give me the output on the river for some reason. So once we go overbet on the turn, we get to the river. What was it? 7 of diamonds. And you can see big blind wants to shove, bet large or medium bet. 7-5 seems to want to large bet. So we're not shoving 7-5 suited. We'd rather shove something like 2nd pair as a bluff. And that's because villains shouldn't have pocket 7s, but they can have pocket 8s. So blocking that part of villain's range is going to be better for going all in because when we go all in, they're going to just snap call their pocket 8s and we lose, right? 7-5 isn't necessarily blocking any calls, but it is folding out weaker hands. So the solver elects to have a couple of sizings here, the large bet and the overbet. The overbet is reserved for blocking the best parts of villain's range, and the large bet is reserved for bluffs that don't necessarily block those hands, but still get better hands to fold. So 7-5 suited could have been a large bet. I don't think shoving is going to be that big of an EV difference, but maybe it is. Let's see. 7-5 shoving versus large bet. Yeah, it's a pretty big mistake here, actually. 7-5 of clubs, it looks to be like almost one big blind EV loss. So that was a blunder. This was a blunder here. I could have gone for the large size instead of the all-in. And yeah, the 8X combos would have been the ones that I found a bluff on. I am happy that I found the overbet and the river bet. I just didn't need to shove the river here. Villain, funny enough, calls with pocket eights and we lose. So this really illustrates how important it is to bluff with the right hands on the river for the right sizing. If I jam, I need to be certain that I'm blocking his calls. If I large bet, it's not as important because I still get some better hands to fold. But obviously, you know, those hands that are going to call are going to call. And some of those hands are going to have auto folds in his range for the large size. So let's say he's got something like pocket kings on the river. Is that going to get to the river? It might. Yeah, pocket kings is going to fold 100% of the time. So we're still getting some really good hands to fold the river when we have our 7-5, but we're just not blocking the nuts. We also get queens and jacks and tens to fold too, and even nines. So we actually have a pretty good bluff here. I just picked the wrong size. We looked at the ace king. Okay, so here's another interesting hand that didn't fully solve for some reason, but king 10 suited. We open, button raises. I decide to 4-bet. This is a good hand to mix between 4-bet and call. I 4-bet. Ace queen 2. This is a flop in which I think we're going to have a very high frequency c-bet. So I go for the quarter pot size. That's fine. Villain calls. Turn is a 7 of spades. And now we are basically saying if I bet again, I have something like an ace or better. So it makes sense that the solver uses a medium size out of position here. I go ahead and do that. And villain calls. And a very unique river hits where I don't have any flushes. I have 0 flushes on this river. Maybe I have a royal. Maybe Jack 10 of hearts is the one combo I have for a flush. I don't know. But I have 0 flushes. Villain technically should have some flushes here, like 4-5 suited. 5-6 suited maybe. 7-8 suited of hearts potentially. So this is maybe going to favor them. I don't know, but I don't really have much left in terms of big blinds, and I should be able to fold out some of their top pair is my thought process here. I think I can get them to fold something like ace jack or ace 10 or ace 5 potentially. So I decided to turn my hand into a bluff. Let's take a look. So we have standard call here, and then the king of hearts. So under the gun, king 10 of spades. It looks like we're indifferent to jamming. The EV difference between all in and check is 0. So this is actually a fine bluff. I have to be careful not to do this too often. 9s and 8s are going to be our more high frequency bluffs, right? 9s and 8s are a little bit more obvious when it comes to bluffing because it folds out better almost every time. If villain folds, they're probably folding some kind of pair, whether it's a queen or an ace or a king on the river. Like it's possible that they rivered some kind of king combo here after floating twice. I don't know what it would be, but I think they have to. Yeah, I think they have to float some like king jack in position here in theory. So once they get to the river, and I bet this 31 sizing, they have to fold something like king jack. They have to fold something like ace jack. They have to fold something like ace 10. So the reason king 10 of spades isn't more of a bluff is because we're blocking the folds. We're blocking the ace 10 of spades, and we're blocking the king jack of spades that are folding. So it's not really that good of a bluff here. We'd much rather use pocket 9s or pocket 8s. I don't think it's inherently a mistake because you can still have some folds from ace 5 and ace 4 in this node, which is what I was basically hoping for. But in game, villain just showed up with something like pocket aces, I think. and slow played until the river. Yeah. And we got wrecked. But turns out that this was not a bad river bluff. As long as I don't get too carried away with this, I'd rather pick something like pocket nines or pocket eights if I was going to find a bluff there. So let's look at another one, and we'll only look at a couple of more to see how well we fared. But you can see this trend where GTO Wizard didn't necessarily solve the last part of the hand. And so I wasn't sure if I was making mistakes. We go back, we look at the river play, and we can determine if I made a mistake. So I raise ace king offsuit. This is four-handed. This is a little bit harder to solve. If I was to try and figure this out, I would have to take one of these players out and then do the multi-way solve. This could get a little bit tricky, so I'm going to skip this for now. But this was actually similar to the hand where the other player had a set of fours against our king-queen. So in this instance, I had ace-king and the button raised in position, and it ended up being that he had pocket nines and I bluff caught the river, and we lost here. I think that this is another example of a cooler, because I believe this hand should be indifferent to calling in most of these scenarios. If I wanted to run this through the multi-way solver, I would just run this through the multi-way solver and find out, but I have a feeling it's going to be fine. I'll run this on my own time, but that's what I would do in that scenario. Let's see. This is the last hand in which we lost a full stack. So let's look at this one. Hijack opens, button 3-bets, and we just have a jam. This is a fine jam spot. I go ahead and jam. Ace king pre-flop. We would also balance this with pocket kings for value. Button calls, and it runs out twice, and I lose. I think villain had pocket queens, and we just lost the flip. So out of all of these really big pots that we lost yesterday, how many of these were really big mistakes? Well, the ace-king hand we determined is not really that big of a mistake, given the sizing that villain used. The king-queen hand we've determined is unlikely a mistake, although, you know, you can maybe exploit a player in this spot if they check raise the flop here, because they might not have enough bluffs. The 7-5 suited hand was a small mistake, but I still would have lost a lot of money if I had used the large bet instead of the overbet. Not much of a difference in that regard. The ace-king suited hand, not really a mistake, as we determined. King 10 suited, not a mistake. Ace-king offsuit, this one is likely not a mistake, but I would run this just to make sure. Ace-king offsuit, this was just a complete standard flip. So all of the biggest hands that we played yesterday, I would determine were not big mistakes if they were mistakes. And I would say that that session I would chalk up mostly to variance. It's sometimes important to really dig deep and figure out what's going on, because I did make mistakes, whether they were big mistakes or small mistakes. There were some that I can learn from, and I'll take that going forward into my next session. So that's how I approach reviewing sessions, getting better, making sure I'm fixing my blunders and fixing my mistakes. And so for the next session, maybe I'll focus a little bit more on my sizing theory and focus on maybe removing the strong hands with my bluffs. Make sure I'm not over bluffing in a spot. Make sure I think about my entire range and whether or not this is a hand in that range that wants to bluff, and really give that more thought before I act. Maybe reduce my tables. This will all help me reduce the amount of blunders and improve my win rate, and also reduce my variance, because when you improve your win rate, you reduce your variance. So that's how I approach studying. That's how I approach getting better. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, comment, tell me how you guys study. Do you guys like to review hands? Do you like to watch other people play? Let me know. I'll hopefully make some more of these in the future if you guys do enjoy this format. All right, guys, have a good one.